Some of the most unbelievable stories in history are not rumors, they're not exaggerations, they're not the result of poor memory or dramatic retelling. They are documented, recorded by governments, preserved in letters, confirmed by archaeology, economics, medicine, and language. And that's what makes them uncomfortable, because if something sounds impossible and still turns out to be true, then impossibility isn't the problem, assumption is. History is often imagined as a steady climb toward intelligence. As if the past was confused, and the present finally figured things out. But that version of history only works if the past was irrational. It wasn't, it was practical, it was adaptive. It made sense to the people who lived inside it. Which means many things that sound absurd today were once considered obvious, normal, efficient, even necessary. There were societies where cleanliness depended on things we now avoid. Economies that ran on materials we treat as trivial. Medical practices that feel theatrical now, but were grounded in the best logic available at the time. And some of those practices worked, not because they were lucky, but because they were solving problems with the tools they had. That's the part that doesn't sit well. Because it suggests that truth is not always intuitive, and progress is not always permanent. In this video, every story will sound fake. Not because it's exaggerated, but because it clashes with modern instinct. You'll hear about systems of value built on something you keep in your kitchen, about medical procedures performed thousands of years before electricity, anesthesia, or modern instruments, and near the end, one of these stories explains something quietly personal, why a habit you struggle with today was once considered natural. None of these stories are speculative. They are supported by records, artifacts, and patterns that still exist. They survived because they happened, and they matter because they remind us of something history doesn't announce clearly: human beings were never foolish. They were contextual. What made sense once can sound absurd later. And what sounds absurd now may simply be logic we've forgotten. Each story you're about to hear will feel impossible. Each one is verifiable. And the final one doesn't just belong to the past, it still follows you home at night. Fact 1: Ancient Romans used urine as detergent. There is a reason this story sounds ridiculous at first. Cleanliness, in the modern mind, is tied to comfort, to fragrance, to things that feel clean, but the Roman Empire did not define cleanliness that way. It defined it by results, by whether fabric came out whiter, by whether stains disappeared, by whether a system worked, at scale. And it did. In ancient Rome, doing laundry was not a household chore, it was an industry. Across Roman cities, there were dedicated laundries known as philonici. Large public facilities where clothing, especially expensive garments, was cleaned, treated, and restored. These were not informal operations, they were regulated businesses, essential to urban life. And they ran on something modern logic immediately rejects. Urine, not as an accident, not as desperation, but as a deliberate input. Fresh human urine contains ammonia, and ammonia is exceptionally good at breaking down grease, oils, and organic stains. Long before chemistry textbooks existed, Romans understood the effect. They didn't know the molecular explanation, they didn't need to. They knew that when fabric was soaked, trampled, and rinsed in aged urine, it came out cleaner than with water alone. So urine became valuable, so valuable, in fact, that it was collected. Public urine jars were placed in cities. People contributed to them intentionally, and the contents were sold directly to laundries. This was not considered strange. It was efficient. Eventually, the system became profitable enough to attract attention at the highest level of government, under Emperor Vespasian. Urine collection was formally taxed. Not because it was unsanitary, but because it was economically useful. When criticized for taxing something so undignified, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and asked a simple question. Did it smell? The money didn't. The logic was clear. Clean clothes mattered more than clean feelings. In Roman society, hygiene was about function, not comfort. Effectiveness, not pleasure. And once you accept that framework, the practice stops sounding insane. It starts sounding practical. Which raises a more uncomfortable point. Disgust is not a universal guide to truth. It is cultural. It changes with context. What feels unacceptable now can be entirely reasonable under different constraints, and the Romans didn't stop there. The same substance that cleaned their clothes also appeared in another part of daily life. One that makes modern discomfort even harder to ignore. They didn't stop at clothes. Fact 2. Medieval doctors thought bad smells caused disease. If the Romans remind us that discomfort doesn't equal inefficiency, the Middle Ages reveal something even stranger. That logic can feel scientific and still be wrong. For centuries, disease was not understood as something microscopic. It was understood as something sensory, something you could smell. In medieval Europe, illness was widely believed to come from corrupted air, from rot, from decay, from foul odors rising from waste, swamps, and overcrowded cities. This belief had a name. The miasma theory. According to this theory, bad air didn't just accompany disease. It was disease. And once that assumption took hold, medicine reorganized itself around a simple rule. If it smells bad, avoid it. If it smells good, it must be safe. This wasn't superstition. It was inference, built from observation. Cities with poor sanitation had higher death rates. Plagues followed decay. Rot preceded outbreaks. The conclusion felt obvious. So doctors didn't look for invisible causes. They focused on the air people breathed. During outbreaks, especially the plague, physicians wore long, beak-shaped masks. Not for intimidation. Not for symbolism. But for filtration. The beaks were stuffed with herbs, spices, flowers, and resins. Rosemary, lavender, cloves. The goal wasn't protection from contact, it was protection from smell. If disease traveled through odor, then pleasant scents were a defense. Hospitals burned incense. Homes were fumigated. Perfumes became medical tools. And in a strange way, some of this worked. People avoided stagnant areas. They opened windows. They moved away from waste. Death sometimes declined, not because the cause was understood, but because behavior accidentally aligned with safer conditions. That's what made the theory durable. It felt effective. But it also delayed something critical. Because as long as disease was blamed on air, there was no reason to search deeper. No reason to consider contamination through water, or touch, or organisms too small to see. The framework explained enough to survive. But not enough to advance, and that's the danger of ideas that almost work. Fear, when dressed in logic, can look like knowledge. And once it does, it resists correction. It would take centuries, and millions of deaths, before medicine accepted that the most dangerous things were not the ones you could smell. But the instinct to associate danger with sensory discomfort never fully disappeared. Even now, we trust what feels clean. What smells safe. What looks orderly. And that instinct has a long memory. Because for a very long time, air was the enemy. Fact 3. People once paid taxes in salt. There's a reason this next idea feels instinctively wrong. Money is supposed to be abstract, metal, paper. Numbers on a screen. It's meant to represent value. Not be the thing you need to survive. But for much of human history, survival itself was the economy, and few substances mattered more than salt. Not for taste, for time. Before refrigeration, salt was preservation. It slowed decay, extended food supplies. Determined whether communities survived winters, droughts, and sieges. A society without salt didn't just eat bland food. It starved faster. That made salt rare in some regions. Difficult to transport, expensive to control. Which is why governments didn't just trade it. They taxed it. In ancient and medieval economies, salt functioned as currency. It could be measured, stored, exchanged. In some regions, people paid taxes directly in salt. In others, wages were issued partially in it, especially to soldiers. Because salt wasn't symbolic value. It was functional value. A payment that could be eaten, preserved, or traded again. This is where language quietly gives the game away. The word salary traces back to the Latin salarium. An allowance associated with salt. Not metaphorically, literally. Compensation tied to one of the most essential materials in daily life. And once that makes sense, the system stops feeling primitive. It feels rational. If your economy is built on survival, your currency reflects survival. Gold is useless if you can't eat, paper means nothing if food rots before winter. Salt solved a problem more urgent than wealth. It bought time. Which reframes something we rarely question. Money is not fixed, it's contextual. What a society chooses to value reveals what it fears losing. For some, it was time, for others, stability, for others still, control, and sometimes, value itself becomes so concentrated that it destabilizes everything around it. The past wasn't irrational. It responded to the conditions it faced. And when those conditions changed, some solutions were lost. Not because they failed, but because they no longer fit.